That morning, I woke up to someone screaming outside my window. But this wasn't just any scream. It was Deborah, the notorious queen of Sunnybrook Estates, the woman everyone in the neighborhood loved to hate. She stood right at the edge of my yard, her face redder than a ripe tomato, shrieking and frantically pointing toward her shiny new Lexus SUV, now hopelessly trapped in a 5-foot-deep trench I'd legally dug around my driveway just yesterday. And to top it off, I'd even installed a fully functional, medieval-style drawbridge that I could raise and lower whenever I pleased. 2 weeks ago, my life was perfectly ordinary. My name's Mike, and I'm just your average guy living at 325 Sunnybrook Estates. I work during the week, grill steaks on weekends, and mostly keep to myself. Honestly, all I ever wanted was a peaceful life. But peaceful wasn't exactly how you'd describe life in Sunnybrook Estates, especially with someone like Deborah running the HOA. Deborah wasn't just strict. She was obsessive. She treated the neighborhood like her private kingdom, ruling over every blade of grass and every mailbox with an iron fist. She was the kind of HOA president who would walk around measuring grass height with a tape measure. 1 inch too long? That's a $250 fine. Paint your front door the wrong shade of beige? Another $250. A tiny spot of dirt on your car? You guessed it. Yet another fine. Up until recently, I'd managed to avoid most of Deborah's attention. Sure, I'd gotten the occasional nitpicky warning, but nothing too crazy. That changed one morning when I walked out of my house, coffee in hand, and nearly dropped it at the sight of Deborah's brand new Lexus SUV parked just 5 feet from my garage door, completely blocking my driveway. At first, I figured there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe she'd accidentally parked there, or she was just stopping by for a quick chat. But as I walked closer, I noticed Deborah standing smugly on the sidewalk, arms crossed and smiling in that way you smile when you've trapped someone exactly where you want them. "Morning, Deborah," I said calmly, trying not to sound annoyed. "Your car's kinda blocking my driveway." "Oh, I know," she replied sweetly, tilting her head slightly. "It's HOA business." I blinked, confused. "HOA business? What does my driveway have to do with the HOA?" She shrugged dramatically. "We've received several complaints about your driveway. Apparently, it doesn't comply with neighborhood standards." Complaints? I looked down at my perfectly ordinary concrete driveway. It wasn't cracked or messy, just plain and simple. "From who?" "That's confidential," Deborah said dismissively, waving a hand as if it didn't matter. "But until the board reviews your case, I'll have to park here to prevent further violations." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. Surely she couldn't be serious. "You've got to be joking." "Nope," she said cheerfully, pulling out her clipboard and scribbling down something quickly. "Oh, and a friendly warning. If you try to have my car towed, that's harassment. Another fine." I stood there, dumbfounded, feeling my anger rise. Deborah loved confrontation. She wanted me to argue, to yell, to lose control so she could slap me with more fines. So instead, I forced a smile, nodded, and walked back inside. The next 10 days were a nightmare. Every morning I woke up to Deborah's Lexus still blocking my driveway, just 5 feet from my garage. I called the HOA, but of course they took Deborah's side. Even the towing company refused to help, mumbling something about neighborhood agreements and vague policies. To make matters worse, Deborah began piling on the fines. Each morning, there was a fresh $250 citation waiting in my mailbox. Why? According to the HOA, my driveway was being neglected because I wasn't actively using it. And why wasn't I using it? Because Deborah's Lexus was parked right in front of it. It was maddening. Deborah strutted around the neighborhood, proudly acting like she'd just conquered new territory. but I wasn't going down without a fight. If Deborah wanted to play dirty, I was going to play smart. I spent every evening buried in research, combing through city ordinances and zoning regulations. If the HOA was going to weaponize their rules against me, then surely I could find a legal loophole to fight back. After hours of digging, I finally stumbled onto something interesting. There was no rule preventing homeowners from making temporary security modifications around their property, as long as they weren't permanent structures. I triple-checked, even calling up an old buddy who's a lawyer. The answer was clear. It was completely legal to build a protective barrier around my driveway, as long as it wasn't permanent. And that's when inspiration hit me. If Deborah thought she was winning this fight, she was about to have a rude awakening. I picked up the phone, rented an excavator for $1,200 a day, and hired a small crew. By sunset, a massive 5-foot-deep trench surrounded my driveway, wide enough to trap any vehicle, and Deborah's Lexus was right in the middle of it. Now, Deborah was about to discover exactly what kind of game she'd started. Deborah's expression the next morning was worth every penny I'd spent. Standing by the trench, she went from smug superiority to absolute disbelief in seconds. "What in God's name is this?" she shrieked, pointing furiously at her Lexus stranded like a luxury island in the middle of my newly dug moat. "Oh, this?" I replied casually, sipping my coffee. "Just a temporary security measure, fully legal under city code. HOA regulations encourage safety enhancements, don't they?" Her mouth opened and closed several times before she finally found words. You can't just dig a trench around my car. This is insane." I shrugged calmly. "Actually, Deborah, it's perfectly legal. Your car just happened to be parked on my property, without permission, remember? So I had no choice but to build around it." She glared at me, eyes twitching slightly. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "The HOA will bury you in fines." I smiled, handed her a printed copy of the city ordinance, and watched her storm off, fuming with anger. But this trench was just the beginning. If Deborah wanted a war, I'd give her one she'd never forget. Over the next couple of days, as Deborah desperately tried to escalate things, calling city inspectors 3 separate times, all of whom left shaking their heads after confirming my trench was completely legal, I quietly planned my next move. I decided the trench needed a special finishing touch. A drawbridge. Yes, a real medieval-style drawbridge with a pulley system that I could raise or lower whenever I wanted. Not only would it be an excellent security feature, but it would send Deborah completely over the edge. I sketched out the plans, hired contractors, and started gathering materials. The neighbors, sick of Deborah's petty tyranny, openly laughed at the idea, encouraging me to build it. After all, Deborah's reign of terror had annoyed everyone. She tried circulating a petition to stop me, but only 8 people signed it. Hardly enough to make a difference. Deborah even attempted to physically block contractors from entering the neighborhood. But when one turned out to be related to a city council member, that plan quickly backfired. Everything was set. Deborah had no idea the best part was still to come, the moment my drawbridge would be fully operational. Construction day finally arrived, and I woke up early, excitement buzzing through me like a kid at Christmas. Trucks rolled into Sunnybrook Estates, carrying wooden beams, heavy metal hinges, thick ropes, and everything else you'd expect for building an authentic medieval-style drawbridge. Neighbors gathered curiously at their windows and front lawns, eager to witness the spectacle. As the crew began assembling the bridge, Deborah marched over immediately, clipboard in hand, scowling fiercely. She pointed at the workers, voice high-pitched and shaking with outrage. "You can't do this! This is a residential area, not some medieval castle theme park." I calmly stepped forward, flashing the official permits I'd already secured from Maplewood City. Actually, Deborah, I've double-checked every ordinance. Temporary structures for home security are perfectly legal and even encouraged by HOA guidelines. You should know, right? She glared at me, face reddening as her authority slowly crumbled. This isn't security. You're turning this neighborhood into a joke. A few neighbors chuckled quietly behind her, enjoying Deborah's meltdown. For once, someone had finally stood up to her bullying, and won. She stormed away, threatening to call every inspector in town. True to her word, the city inspectors arrived 3 separate times throughout the construction. Each time, Deborah stood triumphantly at a distance, certain that this time I'd be shut down. And each time, the inspectors merely shrugged, shook their heads in amused disbelief, and left, giving me the all clear. Deborah's face fell further with every failed attempt. By late afternoon, the drawbridge had started taking shape. Thick wooden beams connected by sturdy metal joints formed an impressive structure, perfectly bridging the 5-foot-deep trench that encircled my driveway. I watched, grinning widely, as the contractors installed the pulley system, allowing the drawbridge to raise and lower with a simple tug on the ropes. Neighbors now openly cheered the project. They were tired of Deborah's obsessive rule enforcement and ridiculous fines. Several came over, bringing cold drinks and snacks for the workers, turning the whole event into a neighborhood block party. Finally, as sunset approached, the workers gave me the nod. It was ready. I stepped up, grabbed the ropes, and pulled smoothly. The bridge lifted effortlessly, rising upward to create a secure barrier, isolating my driveway, and Deborah's Lexus still trapped helplessly in the middle of my trench. The neighbors erupted into applause, some even filming it on their phones. Deborah stood speechless on her porch, mouth agape, clearly struggling to process that she had actually lost control. After a moment, her shock turned to fury. "You've completely lost your mind," she shouted across the street. "You think you'll get away with this? I'll bury you in lawsuits." I smiled confidently back at her, feeling empowered by the support of my neighbors. "Go ahead and try, Deborah, but everything I've done is completely within my rights, and yours is the only car trespassing right now." She stomped back into her house, slamming the door behind her so hard the windows rattled. But I knew Deborah wasn't done yet. She'd never let something like this slide without retaliation. Later that night, after the crowd dispersed, I sat quietly on my porch, sipping a cold beer and admiring my handiwork. The bridge stood proudly above the trench, illuminated softly by streetlights, a monument to standing up against petty authority. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Paul, an older neighbor from across the street. He'd lived in Sunnybrook Estates for decades and had silently watched Deborah terrorize everyone. "You know, Mike," he said, laughing gently, "I've seen a lot of wild stuff around here over the years. But this is legendary." I chuckled softly. "I just got tired of her running the show. Someone had to push back." He nodded, smiling warmly. "Well, you certainly pushed. Deborah might have finally met her match." Days passed, and as predicted, Deborah escalated further. She attempted to label the drawbridge as a public hazard, circulated flyers claiming it was structurally dangerous, and even personally blocked construction vehicles from leaving the neighborhood until the police arrived. Each attempt only made her appear more desperate, and more neighbors turned against her. One afternoon, I found Deborah pacing furiously outside my property, clipboard shaking in her hands. "You think this is funny, Mike? I'll have this torn down if it's the last thing I do," she yelled, nearly spitting with rage. I took a deep breath, speaking calmly yet firmly. "Deborah, everything here is legal. You're the only one breaking rules. Maybe it's time to let it go." She stepped closer, eyes narrowed dangerously. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You're going to regret crossing me." I watched her leave, feeling certain the fight was far from finished. But I was ready. She might have ruled Sunnybrook Estates unchallenged for years, but now she was trapped, literally and figuratively, by her own arrogance. The drawbridge had become more than just a funny way to protect my property. It was a symbol that even the smallest homeowner could stand up against a bully like Deborah and win. Yet even as neighbors celebrated and cheered me on, I sensed that Deborah's ultimate retaliation was still coming. Little did I know, her next move would push things even further and force me to finally confront her in a way neither of us ever expected. A few nights later, everything changed. I was jolted awake around 3 a.m. by a loud crash outside my bedroom window. Heart racing, I quickly jumped out of bed, rushing toward the window to see what had happened. At first, the darkness obscured everything, but when I flipped on the porch lights, my stomach tightened. The drawbridge had collapsed halfway into the trench, wooden planks shattered, and ropes dangling uselessly at the edges. Someone had clearly cut the ropes, causing significant damage. Anger surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I immediately grabbed my phone and opened the security camera footage. And there she was, Deborah, wearing black from head to toe like a second-rate ninja, clutching a large pair of bolt cutters. In the grainy black and white footage, I watched her slip down into the trench, visibly struggling as she maneuvered herself to reach the bridge mechanism. She paused nervously, looked around, then snapped the thick ropes holding up my drawbridge. It crashed down violently, splintering on impact. I felt both disbelief and anger, amazed Deborah had resorted to outright sabotage. Without hesitation, I dialed the police, calmly explained what had happened, and waited. Within minutes, a police cruiser quietly pulled into Sunnybrook Estates. 2 officers got out, approaching carefully and scanning the scene with flashlights. One walked toward me, nodding. "You reported property damage?" the officer asked politely. "Yes, officer," I replied calmly, handing over the video footage on my phone. "It was Deborah from next door. She's been harassing me for weeks, but this crossed the line." The officer reviewed the footage, shaking his head in disbelief. "Wow, clear evidence. Let's have a talk with her." They approached Deborah's house, knocking firmly on her door. After several tense minutes, Deborah finally appeared, no longer looking intimidating, but confused and slightly panicked, hastily pulling a robe tighter around herself. "What's going on?" Deborah demanded sharply, trying to appear authoritative despite her obvious nerves. "Ma'am, we have clear footage of you vandalizing your neighbor's property," the officer said firmly. "We need you to come with us." Deborah's eyes widened in shock. She immediately launched into defensive mode. "This is ridiculous. Mike's bridge was a hazard to the neighborhood. I was protecting everyone." The officer calmly raised a hand to stop her rant. "Cutting ropes on private property at 3 in the morning isn't protecting anyone. It's criminal damage and trespassing." "I'm the HOA president," Deborah protested. "I have a right to inspect properties." "Not at 3 in the morning, dressed in black with bolt cutters," the officer said dryly. "Please step outside, ma'am." Neighbors began to peer through windows and doors, some stepping onto porches as Deborah was escorted toward the police cruiser, still loudly protesting. She turned toward me, eyes furious and filled with humiliation. "You'll regret this, Mike. I'll sue you for everything you own." But this time, her threats held no weight. Her voice faded as the police placed her firmly into the back of the cruiser. As they drove away, a strange silence filled the neighborhood, followed by hushed whispers of disbelief. Deborah, the HOA queen herself, had finally crossed the line and faced real consequences. The next day, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip. My driveway became a community hotspot, neighbors dropping by constantly to discuss Deborah's dramatic downfall. Paul brought over coffee, shaking his head with amusement. "I never imagined Deborah would actually sabotage your property," he chuckled. "She's completely lost it." I nodded, sipping my coffee thoughtfully. I think the power finally got to her head. She just couldn't accept that she wasn't in charge anymore. The drama escalated even further when the HOA board quickly called an emergency meeting to address Deborah's behavior. The clubhouse was packed, everyone eager to witness the outcome. Deborah, released on bail, attended with grim determination, still believing she had some control left. As the meeting started, Deborah immediately stood up, attempting to regain her authority. "Mike's reckless modifications caused this problem. His ridiculous bridge endangered our neighborhood. We must fine him and demand immediate removal." She looked confidently around the room, expecting support. Instead, an awkward silence filled the air. Clearly, Deborah hadn't yet realized just how far her influence had slipped. I stood up, addressing the crowded room calmly. "I understand some concerns about the bridge, but everything I've done is legal. Deborah, on the other hand, intentionally vandalized private property, caused real damage, and abused her power as HOA president. She's even misused HOA funds. I have evidence." Deborah's eyes widened in panic. "That's a complete lie. I've never touched HOA funds." I calmly placed a folder on the table, opening it to reveal meticulous records I'd gathered quietly over the past several weeks. "Actually, Deborah, it turns out you've diverted nearly $25,000 from HOA funds into personal accounts. Vacations, shopping sprees, even suspicious offshore transactions. Do you want to explain those?" The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Deborah's face paled, her facade finally cracking. She desperately looked around, searching for allies, but found none. Even her remaining supporters shrank back, unwilling to stand beside her now. This is outrageous," Deborah stammered weakly. "He's making it all up to discredit me." "Everything is documented, Deborah," I replied firmly. "I'll gladly hand it over to authorities." A long silence followed. Then one board member, Susan, quietly stood. "Considering these serious accusations and Deborah's criminal behavior, I move for an immediate vote on Deborah's removal as HOA president." Within moments, a unanimous vote stripped Deborah of her power. She sat frozen, visibly shrinking in her seat as the decision was made official. Deborah was officially removed as president of Sunnybrook Estates HOA, pending further legal investigation. That evening, word spread quickly. Neighbors openly celebrated, some even hanging signs saying, "Goodbye, Deborah," and HOA free at last. It was a joyous atmosphere, a feeling of relief spreading through Sunnybrook Estates. But Deborah wasn't finished yet. In her final days before moving out, she desperately attempted retaliation. She filed multiple false complaints with the city, claiming my trench was unsafe and unauthorized, prompting several surprise inspections. But each inspector simply chuckled, shook their heads, and left after confirming my permits were valid. Frustrated, Deborah attempted to rally neighbors against me, sending out flyers accusing me of destroying community values. But few paid attention, and most openly mocked her efforts. Eventually, investigators contacted me regarding Deborah's financial fraud within the HOA. I handed over all my gathered evidence, carefully detailing each misappropriation. Within days, Deborah faced formal charges, her petty dictatorship unraveling into a criminal investigation. Local newspapers picked up the story, labeling her the HOA tyrant of Sunnybrook Estates. Deborah's reputation collapsed entirely. leaving her isolated and humiliated. Finally, Deborah's house went up for sale at a significantly reduced price. It sat unsold for weeks, everyone reluctant to buy the home of the neighborhood's fallen dictator. Eventually, she sold it at a substantial loss, quietly packing her belongings into a moving truck. On moving day, I stood in my yard, watching quietly as Deborah loaded the last boxes into the truck. She shot one final bitter glare in my direction, but it no longer held any power. I raised my coffee cup silently in farewell, smiling calmly as she drove away for the last time. With Deborah gone, the Sunnybrook Estates HOA began dissolving rapidly. Most board members resigned in embarrassment, and neighbors overwhelmingly voted to disband the organization entirely. For the first time in years, everyone breathed freely, no longer fearing fines or petty rules. The Drawbridge, now repaired, became a beloved neighborhood icon, affectionately nicknamed Mike's Castle. Kids loved coming by, begging to see the bridge rise and fall, and neighbors joked it had liberated the community from Deborah's reign. Weeks later, Paul stopped by as I grilled steaks in my backyard, admiring the sunset. "Mike," he smiled warmly, "you changed everything. Who knew a trench and a drawbridge could bring down Deborah?" I laughed, flipping the steaks casually. "Sometimes you have to get creative when standing up to bullies." He nodded thoughtfully. "You know, Deborah ran this place for years, controlling everyone with fear. But you proved all it takes is one person willing to push back." I smiled quietly, turning back toward the neighborhood now filled with laughter, freedom, and genuine happiness. Sunnybrook Estates finally felt like home. After Deborah left Sunnybrook Estates, life quickly returned to a calmness I hadn't experienced since moving in. Without her iron fist ruling over every mailbox and lawn decoration, the neighborhood relaxed, becoming happier, friendlier, and more united than ever before. Within weeks, the HOA officially dissolved. Homeowners voted almost unanimously to eliminate the strict rules, ending years of unnecessary stress over trivial matters like grass length or shutter colors. Suddenly, neighbors spent more time outside, chatting comfortably across fences, laughing freely without fear of surprise fines landing in their mailboxes. And as for my now famous drawbridge, well, it became a permanent attraction. Kids from the neighborhood regularly stopped by, begging me to raise and lower it, laughing with delight every time it moved. Some parents joked it was the best entertainment Sunnybrook had ever seen. One even suggested adding decorative flags or torches for effect, which I actually considered for a moment. My driveway became a symbol of resilience against unreasonable authority. The trench, now fully landscaped, featured a small bronze plaque that humorously read, "Here lies the tyranny of Sunnybrook Estates, HOA. May we never forget." It always drew smiles and sparked conversation. As weeks passed, the story of my unique battle with Deborah spread beyond Sunnybrook. Local media outlets picked it up, amused by the absurdity and inspired by the outcome. Soon, I found myself giving interviews, appearing on podcasts, and receiving hundreds of emails from people across America dealing with their own HOA nightmares, asking for advice or simply thanking me for standing up. But what truly mattered most was right here at home. Sunnybrook Estates had transformed completely. Without Deborah's obsessive micromanagement, community spirit thrived. Neighbors held spontaneous gatherings, cookouts, and friendly competitions for best yard decoration, events previously forbidden or heavily restricted by HOA rules. One peaceful evening, as I grilled steaks in the backyard, Paul stopped by again. He leaned against the fence, smiling warmly as he watched the sunset paint the neighborhood in gentle shades of orange and purple. "You know, Mike," he began thoughtfully. When you first started digging that trench, I thought you'd lost your mind. But looking around now, I see you gave Sunnybrook Estates exactly what we needed. Freedom. I laughed softly, flipping steaks onto a plate. Honestly, Paul, at first it was just revenge against Deborah. But somewhere along the way, it became something more. I realized how much we all deserved better. He nodded, eyes twinkling. Well, you've certainly earned your place as a local legend. Nobody here will ever forget what you did. I smiled humbly, glancing around at neighbors chatting, kids playing, and the quiet peace now settling over the entire community. For the first time, Sunnybrook Estates felt like the home I had always hoped it would be, a place of genuine connection and true belonging. Deborah had tried everything to break us apart, but in the end, her tyranny only brought us closer together. In the end, HOAs can set rules to keep neighborhoods nice, but they can't break state or federal laws, like property rights or ADA regulations. Deborah thought she could control everything, but she crossed legal lines, and that's where she lost. The big lesson here is simple. If something feels unfair, don't stay quiet. Talk to your neighbors, get organized, and understand your rights. Keeping evidence like videos or paperwork can help if things get serious. And if you're not sure, always ask a lawyer. It might seem scary at first, but standing up together can change everything, just like it did for us at Sunnybrook Estates. If you've faced HOA issues or know someone who has, share this story to help them realize they're not alone. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories and tips. See you in the next video.